I think the language needs to change. We have to stop demonizing Islam and dehumanizing Muslims by going on and saying Islamic terrorism all the time, calling terrorists jihadis. I mean, this is things that we have been advocating in our organization. I have been personally advocating for decades now. Like, put a stop to this, guys. Yes, that sells newspapers. Yes, that's sensational news to demonize and create a villain in our society. But is this the price we want to pay for it?
The deadly attack on 2 mosques in New Zealand is particularly disturbing for Canada's Muslim community. Just over 2 years ago, 6 Canadians were killed and 19 injured when a gunman opened fire at a mosque in Quebec City. Police in Montreal, Quebec City, Longueuil and Gatineau are among those that have increased security near mosques today. So how is Quebec's Muslim community reacting to the Christchurch attacks? Hassan Guillet is a member of the Quebec Council of Imams, and he joins me from Montreal. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon, and I'm sorry that we're just having a conversation under such awful circumstances. But I just want to ask you, when you see those images coming in from New Zealand, walk me through the emotions you feel.
Well, it's like a horror movie. You see it again. I relived it exactly what we saw on the 29th of January 2017, what happened in Quebec City. So it's like opening the wound again and reliving the same tragedy all over again. So my first thought was for the victims in New Zealand for sure, and for the families in Quebec City, the widows and the orphans in Quebec City too. And I had to call my friends in Quebec City to make sure that they are doing okay with this tragedy, because this tragedy brings back all the bad memory. Or actually, I wouldn't say memory, because memory generally things you forget and remember again. It's the bad feeling and all the what you call it, the turmoil they went through before.
Now, when you do have those conversations, and when people in the community, whether it's from the Muslim community or any community in Quebec, when they come to you as a community leader seeking advice on how to process what has happened, what are those conversations like?
Well, it's very delicate, and generally people, they have tendency to talk about community, the Muslim community or Muslim communities, and actually every community, including the Muslim community, it's a group of individuals. Each person has his own feeling and his own way of tackling things. Certain people are more fragile than others, and you have to be very, very, very careful in how to address each individuals, and to make sure you don't want to alarm them. You want them to be careful. You want them to feel that you are feeling the pain, you are feeling with them, you are putting yourself in their shoes. But in the same time, you don't want them to despair and say, well, the whole universe is against us, or nobody wants us, they want to accept us as Muslims. And I keep telling people, no, this is not the case. There is a tiny minority who is racist and who is violent, but doesn't mean that everybody. And I keep giving them the example of the wave of solidarity and sympathy we had when we had the tragedy in Quebec City 2 years ago. So I say, this is the society we are living in. These are the people who are our friends and our neighbors and our colleagues at work. But there are certain individuals who are very dangerous, who are criminal and very violent. And we as a society as a whole, Muslims and non-Muslim, we should work together to identify these dangerous people, isolate them, and make sure put them out of the state of hurting others.
Some mosques in this country have increased security as a precaution. Do you feel that's necessary?
Well, it will help if it's not to prevent violence, at least to reassure people. Because I know certain people told me that their kids said when they knew that they are coming to the mosque, their kids were saying, no, Daddy, don't go there. They will kill you. There are bad people there who will shoot you. So, and this happened too in what you call 2 years ago when it happens to Quebec City. So seeing the police, the security people around the mosque will help give certain reassurance. But I keep believing that the solution is not a police solution, is not a military solution. is a political solution and an education solution. We should work with the grassroots. We should educate people. This is why, I don't know if you remember or if you knew, in the beginning of the year, to coincide with the anniversary of the shooting in Quebec City, we had a Muslim Awareness Week. The whole week, people from the civic society, churches, synagogues, Buddhist temple, Hindu temple, mosque, we work together to open doors and build bridges and let everybody know that his neighbor is not his enemy. His neighbor is his partner or her partner in building this country, because this country to belong to all of us and we should build it together.
Oh, sorry, no, continue, go ahead.
So the police, yes, we reassure, but it will not prevent. The attack, the best way to prevent the attacks is education, education, education. I invite here politicians as well, media people as well, to start opening their eyes and recognize that this disease that we call Islamophobia exists. We should stop denying the existence of this disease. Yes, what happened today, it's thousands of kilometers away from us, but believe it or not, the name of Alexander Bissonnette, the author of the killing in the mosque in Quebec, was written on the rifle of the assailant today. So instead of exporting our Canadian values of openness and democracy and liberty and equality, we are exporting, despite of all our goodwill, the example of a terrorist.
So do you think in this country, whether it be government, whether it be politicians, whether it be law enforcement, are people taking the threat of racist extremists seriously enough?
They should.
But are they doing enough to take it seriously?
Well, honestly, I don't want to judge people, but I'm judging by the time when we asked to declare a day for Islamophobia, certain people were denying the mere existence of Islamophobia. Certain people were saying if we do this, it means that we are stop the freedom of opinion, the freedom of speech, which is far from our purpose. And certain people were saying it does not exist. And yes, it exists, and it's dangerous. It's killing people.
The last question I just want to ask you, and it's something you mentioned earlier in our conversation here about how kids are reacting. How should parents, particularly Muslim parents, talk to their children about what has happened?
Well, what I advise is we cannot hide this from our kids, because they will see it on TV. They will say, the kids these days, they have their smartphone and they are on social media. So we cannot hide this from our kids, but we should tell them how to say to understand things, that yes, there are certain dangerous people, but these people are not everywhere. We should be careful how to walk, where to walk, with whom to talk. But it doesn't mean that we have to be to have a paranoia and stay at home and not going out. Your neighbor is not your enemy, and loving people are by far more numerous than people who are propagating the hate propaganda. And we should tell our people to make to start to see the difference, not because there is a killer in New Zealand that everybody is a killer, and not because there is a killer who went into a mosque in Quebec City that every time we go into a mosque we might have a killer waiting for us. So we should educate our kid, but you know what, with all my due respect, we should educate our leaders and our intellectual and ourselves about the danger of Islamophobia and the danger of extremism and hate propaganda.
Hassan Guillet, thank you very much for your time today.
All my sympathy and my solidarity with the victims in New Zealand and our victims in Quebec and in Pittsburgh as well, and everywhere around this universe. Thank you very much.
Hassan Guillet, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Global Affairs says no Canadians were harmed in the Christchurch shooting, but it is offering counselling services to Canadians in New Zealand. What other support is Canada offering? Earlier today, I spoke with the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice and Attorney General, Arif Virani. Mr. Virani, thank you for joining us. The first question I want to ask you is, what is Canada offering to do to help New Zealand?
So what we're doing is we've put out a statement by the Prime Minister, by Minister Goodale. There's also been a statement put out by Muslim and Jewish members of Parliament, all indicating our strong support and solidarity with the people of New Zealand, with the citizens of New Zealand, with the law enforcement officials, and with Muslims in that country, but also around the world. We have put out an offer of any aid and assistance that's required by the New Zealand law enforcement authorities. We will be providing that assistance to them.
Have they asked for anything specifically in terms of help? Because, of course, Canada is a Five Eyes ally with New Zealand. Did they specifically ask for anything from Canada in terms of helping with the investigation?
Thus far, I'm not aware of any direct asks for assistance, but Minister Goodale has been in contact with the Minister of Justice in New Zealand and extended the offer. And as you mentioned, as a Five Eyes ally, we are there willing and ready to help if called upon to do so.
You mentioned the Public Safety Minister. Ralph Goodale tweeted earlier today, there's no connection to Canada, but we are seeing increased security at mosques across different parts of this country. Should Canadians be afraid or concerned about copycat attacks?
So the most important thing that I can say to everyone who's watching the show is that people should feel safe and secure in terms of going to places of worship. In particular, Muslims today, I'm a Muslim Canadian Member of Parliament. Today is Friday, the day of Jummah prayers, the holiest day of the week for Muslims. People need to understand that you are free to worship and you are safe to worship in Canada, regardless of the place of that worship. An attack such as this, no matter where it is in the world, when it's at a place of worship, is an attack on all places of worship. And we want all Canadians to feel safe and secure, whether that's at a temple, a mosque, a synagogue, a gurudwara. Yes, we've been in touch with law enforcement authorities. The RCMP has been in touch with local law enforcement agencies around the country. We are responding because we want to ensure that that feeling of safety and security is intact and people know that they are safe and free to worship and secure to worship.
Personally, how do you feel when you watch what's unfolded?
I'm horrified. I mean, Katie, how would you expect anyone to feel? I mean, I heard about this morning. I am a father raising two young boys. My wife gave me the news and my heart went into my stomach. I mean, it just felt like a repeat of the Quebec City shooting. However, the death toll is 8 times as high. There's equally the same number of people that are injured. I think it's incredibly devastating to learn about an attack on a place of worship. And I think it just makes you think about what a place of worship is. Usually it's a place of safe haven, it's a place of asylum, it's a place where people go to feel secure. That doesn't matter which faith you belong to. And as a father trying to raise some young boys and introduce them to the Islamic faith, it's hard for me to think about turning down the car radio as I did this morning when the CBC was covering this on the current, and not wanting my little 8-year-old to hear about Muslims being attacked while he's learning about Islam and the tenets of the faith.
The threat level in Canada has not changed, but should Canadians feel confident that law enforcement and security services are devoting adequate resources to investigating right-wing extremism, right-wing extremism?
I think what we're doing is we're taking a completely neutral approach to it, which means we're looking at extremism from all vantage points. So that includes right-wing extremism, that includes more traditional forms of extremism. We are investing the funds and we are dedicating resources. I'll point to 2 things that should give people some assurances. One was the security infrastructure program, which we doubled in the wake of the Quebec mosque shooting attacks. We heard renewed calls to reinvigorate that program further after the Pittsburgh synagogue attacks. We're studying that carefully right now as to what we can do further. We also created a Centre for Community Engagement, which is meant to literally reach out to Canadians right around the country from coast to coast to coast to better understand what leads people down a path of extremism and violence. And that centre looks at extremism in all its forms, including far-right extremism, which at times and very recently has become more violent and more pernicious in Canada and in other parts of the world than any other type of extremism. And that's something that we are alive to, we're looking at the evidence, and we are responding to.
So does there need to be more resources put into that right-wing extremism. That we know that the Montreal-based Centre for Prevention and Radicalization, they came out with some numbers in 2017. They received 74 requests relating to concerns around right-wing extremism, up from just 11 in 2016 and 13 in 2015, which of course represents a substantial increase. Does the government need to put more resources into the fight to make sure that right-wing extremism, that we don't see a repeat of what we saw or what everyone's watching in New Zealand right now and what happened in Quebec?
I think the notion of resources is an important part of this conversation. It's obviously something that we're looking at very carefully as we allocate resources. Obviously, we've got a budget coming up on Tuesday where announcements about fiscal spending will be made. What I think we also need to look at, though, is a sort of very much a grassroots sort of initiative. We need to bring people together, and we need to have people in better dialogue. What I found even in my own riding here in Toronto of Parkdale High Park is that every time there's an incident, people cry out for a better understanding. They want to demystify what's inside that temple, what's inside that synagogue, what's inside that mosque. And I'm very reassured, unfortunately, sometimes in the wake of a tragic incident, but even in my own riding, people have been reaching out to my office saying, what are we doing about interfaith dialogue? How can we reach out to our Muslim neighbors and brothers and sisters? I was just there at what's called the Jummy Mosque in my riding, and as I was communicating with individuals, they told me neighbors had already put flowers at the doorstep of the mosque, indicating their solidarity with the Muslim community and giving them a sense of assuredness that they should feel safe here in Toronto. But we need that extrapolated around the country, literally in neighborhood by neighborhood, mosque by mosque, synagogue by synagogue, because this isn't just an anti-Muslim issue. The rise of this right-wing extremism targets many communities, including the Jewish community. And you talked about statistics. We know that in terms of the last 3 or 4 years, the hate crime statistics against Jews and against Muslims have been going up, and that's a constant source of concern.
Really quickly, you mentioned the budget there just for a second. Should we expect new kinds of fundings in the budget towards this kind of prevention?
I think I can't sort of predict what's going to be in the budget. I know what my constituents are asking for. They're looking at some of the bread and butter concerns that relate to housing. They're looking at concerns that relate to infrastructure, et cetera. But obviously, it's top of mind right now when we're thinking about security of places of worship, what may or may not be possible with respect to the funding that's put into the fight against extremism, particularly right-wing extremism.
Canada and New Zealand are both members of the Five Eyes network, which is, of course, Canada, the US, the UK, Australia, and New Zealand. Intelligence agencies share information to prevent things like this from happening. Is what happened in New Zealand a failure of that network?
I don't think it's a failure of the network. I think it is shocking in terms of its gravity, in terms of the locale. I think New Zealand is a place that's has hallmarks and a lot of similarities to Canada. It's a peace-loving nation. It's a democratic nation that shares a lot of our values about diversity. We know how well they approach Indigenous reconciliation with respect to the Maori community, for example. I don't think it's a failure of security. What I think it shows, though, is that all nations are subject to this kind of right-wing extremism, and all nations need to be vigilant. And I think it's also appropriate that people are condemning it, not just legislators, but also just regular citizens and residents, and calling it by the terms that it needs to be called. What we saw was a terrorist attack, an act of hatred, an act that manifested Islamophobia. That's the terminology that we use because it's the appropriate terminology to describe what we're seeing.
Mr. Virani, thank you for your time today.
Thank you very much.